Hey there, this is Dan and you're watching the Salty Sea. Today I'm going to be getting back to basics with Warcry with a guide on the universal abilities that every faction has access to. A lot of my recent videos and a lot of recent community talk has been around the really exciting expansion of faction abilities that came in through the Grand Alliance books. But the universal abilities are still probably the most important set to really master as you get into the game, since they are sort of available to you at all times, no matter who you're playing, and because a couple of them, even with the brand new sort of swath of abilities that we have from the GA books, a couple of them still kind of uh, are core to the backbone of every game you're going to play. So let's get right into it. The first one is Rush. It's sort of the base movement ability that um, a lot of factions really really need. So it just says add 1 to the move stat of this fighter until the end of their activation. Um, this one's not very powerful, but it's extremely necessary to use if you don't have a better option, which is true of most warbands in the game. Now, some warbands have sort of area of effect movement triples, say like what the War Chanter does, um, or what Tempest's Eye can do. And then sometimes you also see something like the Slanesh double or the Untamed Beasts double, where you get to uh, add 1 to move, but then 1 to attack later. So it's better in a very specific circumstance than Rush is. But otherwise, Rush is really important, especially in round 1, to use usually on your most important fighters to just get them into position, get them into combat, doing what they need to do as far as this mission goes. It's an incredibly unspectacular ability, but really important, especially in round 1. And then it's also really important in any kind of, say, treasure mission or any of the missions like, say, Blood Marked or Cut Off the Head or um, any one where you have to destroy one entire deployment group, because in those missions, running away is actually a big part of the game. Trying to play keep away with your last living fighter as you try to hunt down their fighter can be really important. And if you don't have better options in your warband, which is, again, true of most warbands, then Rush is going to be really great for you. Then let's get into Onslaught. And Onslaught might be the most important ability in Warcry, even with all the faction abilities out here. So let's just read it over first. You add 1 to the attack's characteristic of attack actions made by this fighter until the end of their activation, and you do this on a double. So the best targets are usually going to be elite units or mid-level units that are stuck in combat with something that's a high value target, something you really want to kill. And when you decide what you're going to put Onslaught on, it's really usually going to be about maximizing damage versus securing a kill. Now, Onslaught just adding 1 to the attack's characteristic, that usually maths out to quite a good damage boost, 25% if your fighter has 4 attacks, for example, which is the average. A few factions do have something that does a little bit more than this on a double. Again, to reference Slanesh, they have an ability for their Demonettes that can give them a slightly higher percent buff than Onslaught does. But most warbands don't. Onslaught is the best damage boost they have, and that's why it's so important. So let's talk a little bit about, in action, what Onslaught looks like. So here's a little table that's going to show you sort of the reasons why it's so much better to use on your elite units. Things with sort of high strength and high damage characteristics matter a lot more when you are looking for something to put Onslaught on. So let's say that you just bought the Catacomb starter set and you're looking at your Scions of the Flame, right? So your Blazing Lord, the leader, gets 2 out of Onslaught, but it actually doesn't get more than the second most powerful thing, because that guy's got fewer attacks and more damage per attack. So he actually goes from doing slightly less damage than the Blazing Lord to doing the same with Onslaught. And then you have your Fireborn, which are your sort of semi-elite guys. And Onslaught, it just gives a slight buff to them, so they're doing 1.33 extra damage per attack with Onslaught on average. Of course, you're not getting exactly a third of a damage, but then the potential on average, again over 2 attacks, is going to be 2 and 2/3, which can be a nice boost, certainly, but isn't as efficient per dice that you're using as using it on the really elites. And then if you look at the Initiate, that one's even lower, right? It's half of what the Fireborn is getting you as far as bonus damage off of Onslaught. So you get nearly double the output from the same dice when targeting an elite. And so in the abstract, that's much better. So if you want to stay casual and just decide you'll always use Onslaught on your Brazen Champion, you're going to be right about 75% of the time, which is great. But, also looking at some other factors, like, say, what if the Brazen Champion is out of combat? Moving and hitting once is going to give about the same bonus damage to a Fireborn hitting twice. So that can be one complication of considering which to use. But if you want to get sort of a little bit more into the weeds or a little bit more competitive, we can dig in further, right? Because we don't always want to just go with whoever's doing the most damage. So let's simulate some battle situations. What if they're all starting the round in combat with Shroud Blades, which are the chaff unit from the unit they fight in Catacombs, the Knight Shadow Stalkers. So a Shroud Blade is toughness 3, 8 wounds. And because it's got this low damage amount, you're often looking at different outcomes than total damage. So I've put the 3 that make most sense for putting on Onslaught. I'm dropping the Blazing Lord, not because he's bad, but just because his numbers are just like the Brazen Champs, but not as good with Onslaught. So the Brazen Champion, you're going from 49% to 72% as far as your chance of killing it in one hit. Now, I'm using a damage calculator for these that I will link in the notes below. It's a great tool for math hammering your Warcry warband. So anytime you want to take your warband a little past the casual level, I can't recommend this more highly. So then the Brazen Champ goes to killing it eventually, so killing it in 2 attacks, from 94% to 99%. So if you care about getting the kill, it doesn't really matter, right? Because the Brazen Champion is going to take it out anyway. So really you're just looking at that 22% increase for getting it in one shot. So you need to think about what can you actually get out of the extra move that would open up for you from the Brazen Champion. Now, this is kind of the same for the Fireborn, right? It's getting about the same percent increase for your chances to take something out in one shot, right? 22%. Now, it's, of course, less reliable because you're only going to a 2/3 chance to take out the Shroud Blade in one shot. But again, it's something where you're thinking about either the extra move that you're going to get from using it or the 12% increase in chance that you'll take it out in 2 hits, right? So you are thinking about, can you, with the extra move, get onto an objective or take a treasure token or something like that? And if not, then Onslaught's not really helping that much. Usually the cost of the dice could be used better elsewhere. But then we look at the Initiate, right? So the Initiate's chance to one-shot kill a Shroud Blade is almost nothing, right? It starts with 3.5%. Even Onslaught only boosts it to 9%. But the chance of killing that unit eventually goes from 41% to 65% if you're using Onslaught on your Initiate. So that's a pretty good increase as far as just taking out the unit. So in this situation, if your top priority is taking out as many opposing fighters as possible, then actually using Onslaught on your least efficient unit is totally justifiable. And so just maximizing damage isn't necessarily the best policy here because Shroud Blades, they have so few wounds that adding extra damage on top of just what's lethal isn't really getting you a more efficient outcome. So what are some sort of main takeaways from using this ability? So do you need to memorize all the numbers for your warband? Well, no, you don't need to. I mean, unless you want to, right? Maybe one day we'll have high stakes Warcry tournaments and it'll be worth it to commit some common odds to memory. But, for just playing casually, it's quite a lot of work as far as how much it'll actually raise your win percentage. But you can sort of take this to some theory and some general things that you can be thinking about as you play, right? So first, you're going to want to survey your team at the start of the round and see sort of who is in what sort of combat. And then you're really just thinking three things. You can just have a checklist, right? When you have a double or two doubles that you can use, and you're just surveying to see who you should target them for later in the round. One, will this help me get a kill? Like we saw in the Initiate, huge percentage increased chance for getting the kill, even though it wasn't going to do the most damage total. Two is, will this free up an activation, right? Can I get a free movement out of this supposed damage buff that's actually allowing me to move somewhere because I've taken something out in one shot? And then three, how do I maximize damage? This is much more important, when using Onslaught against big elite units. In the previous slide, if we talked instead about, say, what if they were all fighting Shroud Queens, who is the leader of the Shadow Stalkers? Well, then Onslaught brings the Brazen Champ's odds from eventually killing her from 19% to 53%, which is great. But even if you don't get the kill, just the value there of putting on all that extra damage is really huge. So knowing which of these takes precedence is just going to come down to experience. But, this is as far as theory can take you, right? Is looking at these three checklist items, and then, the rest is play skill. And I'm really looking forward to us eventually having tournaments to look over and to kind of dissect finals games to see what the winners are prioritizing between these three options. But these are definitely the three things that you need to be thinking about with this ability. So then moving on to the universal triples, we have Respite. Now, Respite says, a fighter cannot use this ability if they are within 1 inch of any enemy fighters. Remove a number of damage points allocated to this fighter equal to the value of this ability. Now, this is almost always terrible, okay, because the value of the ability is going to be anywhere from 1 to 6, and so even if it's a 6, that's really not a lot of healing. Lots of units do more than 6 damage in just one attack. So using an entire triple to do what's less than usually an attack's worth of healing is just a horribly inefficient way to use your dice. But it's not always useless. So every once in a while, you'll see a situation when you want to use it, say, on your unit that's the target in a hunter mission, something where, let's say, the unit that you're running away with is able to kill the thing that's attacking it, and then you may as well heal to give yourself more time to evade more units while you get to hunt down their target unit. Something like that. But really, it's incredibly rare that you'll ever use this. So let's get to the other triple, which is Inspiring Presence. Pick a friendly fighter that is not activated yet this battle round, and that is within 6 inches of this fighter. You can activate that fighter immediately after the activation of this fighter ends. Now, this is a pretty narrow ability, and it is, well, and by narrow, what I mean by that is there aren't a lot of situations when you can use this effectively, but when you can, it's very effective. I have actually, part of why I decided to record this video was I played a game where I didn't use this ability. I used my faction triple instead, and then looked back and thought that I actually might have won if I had used this ability. So part of why this is narrow is there's no increase in total damage out of this, right? So as far as just the way Warcry can sometimes shake out, where you're really just adding up the amount of damage you can do to your opponent and seeing if it uh, adds up to their life totals across, the units that you need to take out. This doesn't really help with that. But where it does really help is in the activation wars, right? So in Age of Sigmar, they talk about the activation wars as far as fights first, right? But in Warcry, we talk about it in terms of how many sheer numbers of activations you have. Um, so, some warbands with lots of units will usually have a slight advantage over the more elite warbands just because they're doing more things. And the more things you do, the better off you are in almost every strategy game. Even if those things are sort of supposed to be balanced to be sort of less powerful individually, often just more things is better. So, where Inspiring Presence can really help you is if you can get it so that you make your action and then the friendly fighter is going to take out a fighter from your opponent who hasn't activated yet, who would have been next. And then in those situations, you're essentially just scratching an activation from your opponent that they just never get to use, even though they brought the fighters. And that can be really valuable. So it's just going to be in very specific situations, just in round 2 usually, because that's when the lost activations for your opponent gives them longer to sort of snowball over the course of the game, right? Just preventing a response. It needs to be in a situation where you have the damage already to take out the opposing fighter that you need. You just need the time. This is purely a tempo ability. But when it is useful, it's very important. And if you can find a good use for it early on in the match, that lost fighter that they'll do, they can never get those activations back. So that'll be great for you. Finally, we have Rampage. And I love this ability. It's so flavorful whenever you use it, especially if you're using it on your leader, so that they just go crazy, traveling across the board, doing amazing things. So let's get into it. This fighter makes a bonus move action. Then they can make a bonus attack action. Super simple, beautifully worded. I love it. And then this is actually one of the best quads in the game. Very few factions have a quad that's actually better than Rampage. Now, a lot of them have quads where in certain specific situations you'll want to use that over Rampage. So you'll use Rampage, say, 2/3 of the time, but the other one 1/3. And even those are pretty good. It's very rare that a faction has a quad, say like Gloomspite Gits, where you'll almost always want to run it over Rampage. Now, one thing to note here is it's very difficult to rely on this ability. You only have a 37% chance of getting a quad, even if you're willing to spend a wild dice. So when you're sort of planning one round around hopefully getting a quad in the next round, just know that it's not a very reliable thing to do. Now, Rampage is, like most abilities, by far the best on an elite unit, and there's way fewer exceptions than with Onslaught. And part of that is just because you're getting free activations, right? And so it's not about just adding damage to existing activations. This is about just full activations. And elite units, their activations just do more. So if you're just getting 2 free ones, use it on the highest impact unit that you've got. Now, let's talk about it actually in action, right? And when to use it. So you have 3 windows. You can do it before your first activation, in between your 2, or after the second activation. And patience is often rewarded, I find, with using Rampage. And what I mean by that is you get really rewarded by having at least 2 elite sort of heavy-hitting units in your warband, where with your first one, you can often just attack once, see how it's going, and then choose to do Rampage or not based on the situation. So you're really looking to create 3 different sets of results here, and you're just hoping to get the highest impact one for your situation. So the first one is going to be splitting moves and attacks to get multiple kills. So let's say you've got that elite unit, you make an attack, and you take something out. Well, if you're within striking distance of something, that's the perfect time to use Rampage because, otherwise you would only just be able to move to that next unit and that'd be it. So with Rampage, you can attack once, you take out your target. Now you can move and then attack again, which is just wonderful. And then you actually have an attack action left, so then you can actually attack something twice. So you could take something out, move, and then get 2 attacks on an elite fighter, something like that. Or with some of these range 2 specialists, like say the Aviarch on disc from Disciples of Tzeentch, or the Myrmidon I think has range 2, or the Wrathmaster out of Khorne Bloodbound. Those ones often you can get into a situation where you can take out a target with 1 attack, move into an area where there are multiple defending fighters within that 2-inch range of yours, and then you can actually take out 3 things sometimes if you're using Rampage in the middle of your activation. The other way you can use Rampage is by, say, you could move twice, then Rampage, and then you get to get an attack onto something that is very far away. And then you can use Rampage to, say, some of these not very fast, incredibly hard-hitting units, again, like the Myrmidon I've shown, or say something like a Doom Bull. You can actually bring that incredible hitting power to something really far across the table that your opponent just wasn't thinking about. And even if they know at the beginning of the round that you've rolled a quad, sometimes they still won't totally, they'll still sometimes underestimate in their head because they've been thinking about your slow, beefy unit in a certain way. Finally, it can be really nice to just put 3 attacks onto a single elite unit. So you can just use it before your first movement, take the move, and now you have your bonus attack and then 2 other attacks. So you can have a elite unit that thought it was safe at the end of the previous round. You roll your triple, use your wild dice to take a quad, and now your elite unit is coming in and putting down 3 attacks on it, which 3 attacks from a warband's beefiest unit is often enough to kill, the other warband's leader. So that's how you're looking to use Rampage. Those are the effects that you're looking to get out of Rampage, and the incredible flexibility from this that you can get from this. One, it's incredible for storytelling in your games, right? Any campaign game where you got to shoot off Rampage is just always going to be a memorable situation that you tell friends about for your favorite warband. But also, this is also one of the reasons why it's good to have 2 different heavy hitters, so that when you roll that quad, you have just a ton of options for what you're looking at. So what do these universal abilities mean for you, right? How do you balance looking at these abilities versus your chosen faction abilities? Well, Onslaught and Rampage are sort of the 2 defining abilities of the game, both in a lot of specific games and in the game overall, sort of the meta game around the game. Onslaught and Rampage are going to be some of the highest impact things you can do no matter what faction you're playing. And this makes it so that strong faction or leader triples are sort of extra valuable because they don't compete for space with the sort of most popular, or not most popular, but most powerful universal abilities in the game. So if you're looking at a leader, say, to build your warband around, and you see one with a really exciting quad, now that can be really useful still, but just remember that every leader that hits really hard also has its own incredibly exciting quad. It's just called Rampage, right? The same is true for any unit that does a ton of damage on its hits. It has this built-in ability called Onslaught that can be really helpful for it. So I often value things like the area of effect buff triples that some leaders have. I sometimes value those just a teeny bit higher than I would otherwise, just because they don't compete for space with Onslaught or Rampage. And then the other way I balance them is when I'm sort of going to play a faction, you know, planning to play it a few times in a row, not just casually once. I like to sort of plan my game plan around sort of the highest value abilities before playing. That can help you really decide how you're moving units because you know in one round what you're hoping to achieve in the next round with your abilities. Sort of letting you sort of plan not just one move ahead in terms of the chess match that happens within each round and the movements, but planning a whole round ahead. But also, feel free to just not do that, right? Warcry is an amazing sort of just set up and roll some dice kind of game, so you really don't have to stress out too much about these. It's sort of the perfect overlay over the game where it's something where you can absolutely obsess over the just very intricate math behind when Onslaught is the most effective, or just have fun with them and remember the little corner cases when using that rare use of respite or something can actually give you that one heal that actually won you a game. And when you do get to that situation, you're going to remember it for a really long time and have a ton of fun. So there you have it. This is the guide to all of the universal abilities in Warcry. I hope that was really helpful, and I really hope this can be a resource for newer players. If anybody is getting into the game that you know and is starting to play a lot, feel free to show them this. I would be incredibly sort of thankful if you did. And I'm going to be back with more Warcry videos in the future. So until then, may all your rolls be crits.